Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Portsmouth Public Library's local history talk on the secret life of gulls, of the gulls of Appledore Island, presented by Dr. Sarah Courchesne. My name is Polina Vasiliev, and I'm the Special Collections Assistant at the Portsmouth Public Library. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Katie Chakowski, the Special Collections Librarian. I have a few notes from the library I'd like to run through quickly before we begin. First, I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves the Wabanaki, or people of the dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. This program will last until 8:30, and we plan to be respectful of your time. If you have questions about library services or upcoming programs, feel free to ask them at the end. Or if you have any questions over the course of the program for Sarah, feel free to drop them in the chat. Before I introduce Sarah or Dr. Courchesne, I would just like to let you know about a couple of our upcoming library events. Thursday, August 26th at 7 p.m. on Zoom, Skip Finley will give a presentation on Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy, based on his recently published book of the same title. Please join the Lane Memorial Library, Hampton Historical Society, Seabrook Library, and Kingston Community Library, as well as the Portsmouth Public Library for this joint history program, which will explore the story of whaling's leaders of color in an era when the only other option was slavery. Next month, as part of our continuing local history series, on Tuesday, September 14th at 7 p.m. on Zoom, the Portsmouth Herald's food journalist, Rachel Forrest, will join us online to give a presentation entitled Culinary Legacies: How Portsmouth's Iconic Restaurants and Historic Foodways Created Today's Vibrant Culinary Scene. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library, so I will share an online event feedback form in the chat. Fill it out, and you not only help the library, but you'll also be entered to win a library book bag. The only stipulation is that the bag must be picked up in person at our library in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Okay, let me now introduce our presenter for this evening. Sarah Courchesne was raised in Amesbury, earned her BA in English at UMass-Amherst, and her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree at Tufts. She directed the Seabird Ecological Assessment Network, SEANET, a community science project aimed at identifying patterns and causes of seabird mortality. Formerly an adjunct instructor at North Shore Community College, she joined the faculty at Northern Essex Community College in 2014, teaching chemistry and biology courses. She's now professor of natural sciences and co-leads a multi-year study on the ecology of Great Black-backed Gulls on Appledore Island in Maine, and is committed to creating access to the field of biology experiences for NECC students and members of the public. Sarah also writes the Backyard Naturalist column for Merrimack Valley Magazine. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. The city of Portsmouth, I mean, you really can't get much more proximate to Appledore Island than that. So being able to present to you all is pretty exciting. And I've seen a few names of people I recognize in the audience, which makes me a little bit nervous because some of them know a lot more about Appledore than I do, but hopefully I at least will get the gull stuff right. So I'm going to take you guys right into it. I'm sure most of this is not news to you, but just to orient those of you who may not be familiar with exactly where the Isles of Shoals and Appledore are, the archipelago straddles the New Hampshire-Maine line. So Appledore is the largest of the Isles of Shoals, and it is on the Maine side of the line. And that is where we work with our gulls. So these images are always like strike me as kind of zany, these like combo images where they throw a bunch of different photos of the same kind of bird all in one place so you can try to identify them. So I don't expect you to take all of this in, but just to give you a sense of what goes on out on Appledore. So we have two different species of gulls that breed there and nest there. They are the herring gull. So those are the ones on the left-hand side of the screen. They're kind of your classic light gray-backed gull. You'll see them on the beach. You'll often see them in parking lots. They're not the only species that you'll see kind of in these human habitats. human-dominated habitats, but they are extremely common. And this is the standard adult form, the full adult form, and they come in this whole range of browns and grays as they age into adulthood. It takes our gulls 4 years to become fully adult, ready to breed, and in their kind of accustomed adult plumage. So that's why you see so many different varieties here. They're all herring gulls. And then the other gulls that nest on Appledore are the Great Black-backed Gulls. And those are the ones that we've really turned to studying in detail. We are still interested in the herring gulls, but we focused most of our effort on the Great Black-backed Gulls. And they are enormous. They are the coolest bird. They are the world's largest gull, I will have everyone know. And if you Google them, you'll find phrases like real bruisers as descriptors of these guys. So, and that is pretty apt. They have a wingspan about as wide as I am tall. So they can be intimidating to work with, but they are just the coolest things. So this is zooming in on Appledore Island. This is a map that Mary Elizabeth Everett, my co-lead on the project, made for us. And it shows, hopefully you can see some detail here. So this is the outline of the island. We have 2 different colored dots here. The blue are the herring gulls and the red are the blackbacks, and each dot represents a nest. Now these birds, the male and the female, are equally responsible for incubating the eggs, raising the chicks, getting them to fledging. So that means each dot represents a pair of gulls that are equally committed to the rearing of those young. And you can see that there are places in the island where it's very dense. There's lots and lots of dots. So these birds tend to nest quite close to each other. They are colonial nesting seabirds. So they'll tolerate their neighbors. And I say tolerate loosely because if you visit Appledore, it won't look a lot like tolerance, but they will nest within feet of each other. So you can see very dense areas where they'll nest in that way. These blocky structures down sort of in the middle of the island, these represent buildings. So Appledore houses the Shoals Marine Laboratory, which functions as essentially a mini college campus over the summer. It's dedicated to undergraduate education. So it's teeming with faculty and students and student researchers and interns all summer long, and that overlaps with the nesting period of the gulls. So, and you can see these dots are pretty hard up against some of these buildings. So as students are traveling from classrooms to dorms and to the dining hall, they're walking within feet of these birds because they nest right on the ground. So you can see this is a great black-backed gull sitting in its nest. It sometimes startles people when they set foot on the island and there's a bird just sitting right there on the ground next to them. But it's a good strategy if you are an island nesting bird, because most of the hazards we would associate with nesting on the ground are because on the mainland, we have ground-based mammal predators like raccoons and skunks and things like that. And Appledore's far enough off the mainland that those animals can't swim out there. So it really shouldn't be much of a problem to nest right on the ground in the open, because your predators as a seabird on Appledore are mainly going to come from above. So they're going to be things like peregrine falcons, bald eagles. We had one of those harassing the gulls all summer. So it's not such a bad thing to be on the open, in the open, on the ground, able to see up above you, because that's where most of the threat is going to come. So once the eggs hatch, the babies at first are these adorable little puffballs, and you can see they just sit on the rocks as well. So their parents are responsible for sheltering them, helping them if it gets too hot or too cold to kind of keep them warmer or cooler. And as they grow, by the time we get towards late July, the babies have gone from being this size, which is how we encounter them in May, and then over the course of just about 2 months, they've reached adult size. They're not colored the same as an adult, but they're as big as an adult. They can fly and they can fledge off the island, and the island gets much quieter at that point. So we call these guys the gulls of Appledore because that's where they nest and breed, but that's not where they spend their whole year. It's really just a comparatively safe place to raise your babies, and then the birds disperse at the end of the nesting season, at the end of summer. So if you visit Appledore in the fall, it's a very different experience because most of the gulls are gone, so it's much quieter. So the origins of the project, as I'm going to describe it to you all tonight, started back in the early 2000s, and it was started by a then PhD student named Julie Ellis. And she was interested in something much more focused because it was a PhD project. So it needed to be finite, needed to be manageable for her PhD. And so what she was truly interested in was more how do gulls engineer their environment? So how do they change the plant community that lives on the island? How do they interact with other animal species? How do they change the soil chemistry by pooping and bringing food from the ocean up onto the land? That sort of thing. And then sort of as a whim, she and some collaborators thought, what if we just place some bands on some of these birds so that we could recognize them individually and just see where they go, see where they turn up, see who spots them and what they're up to. And so at this point, so that was early 2000s. We're now, almost 20 years into this project. And we have expanded on that mission of looking at individual gulls and where they go and where they spend their time and who they fraternize with into the main focus of our project. So the banding has become much more central. And you can see if you look here, we actually banded Julie one day. We captured her and we threw her in a sheet and we pinned her down and we placed bands on her because we felt she needed to understand exactly what she was putting the birds through. So she was doing all this work as a PhD and then continued it past that. But most of the work of the project has been very much volunteer based. So I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out to this guy down here, Bill Clark, who was with the project for many, many years, only recently retired from volunteering on it, and just gave so much of his time. He would come out to the island every year. He was the one that would correspond with people who wrote in asking questions about our banded gulls. He was really tireless until he wasn't and decided he was too tired. So this is the kind of thing that this project draws people who are just deeply committed to it and aren't getting paid and are just doing it out of interest and the goodness of their own hearts. And Bill is definitely one of those people that we are extremely grateful to. So at this point, I am co-lead of the project. I'm also a volunteer, so I do teach at a community college. Community colleges are teaching only, so there's no research element to my job. So all of this gull work is on the side, and it's something that I do because I also believe in it. I believe in it for multiple reasons that we will get to. My co-lead, Mary Elizabeth Everett, is also my sister, so we're just kind of pulling in whoever we can get. And she now has taken over all the correspondence. So if you happen to see a banded gull out in the world and you write into us and say, hey, I saw this in downtown Portsmouth, what's the story? She will now provide you with a full natural history of that bird, such as we know it since the time we banded it. She's also very expert with mapping and GIS. So she's the one that made that map of the nest that I showed you. She does a ton of work. She really should be considered more than the co-lead. She's kind of doing most of the work at this point. And then the other person I wanted to mention is Dr. Kristen Covino, and she is out in California now. She started as a volunteer on the Gull Project. She's now a professor, and she has her own research lab. And so we're very pleased to be able to contribute not only data, but samples to her reproductive and endocrinology work on birds. She works not just with gulls. Sadly, she also works with like little goofy songbirds, but you can't get everything in a friend. So, we tolerate that because Kristen is pretty great. So we've kind of pulled together this really cool and like motley group of people who just feel this deep enthusiasm and passion for these birds and really want to do this work of kind of following through their lives and getting a sense of everything that happens to them insofar as we can know it. Over their long lifetimes, because these gulls can live decades. So they can live into their 30s, certainly, easily. So one of the things that we often get asked, and it is something that we are very interested in as well, usually when you tell someone that you study wild birds, they'll say, what kind? And then you say gulls, and they're like, gulls, why? They're just rats with wings. So you get a lot of like negative emotions coming out about gulls. And I think that points to people's perceptions of them. So if you ask people what they tend to think of gulls as very common, which by itself shouldn't be a problem. Birds should be more common than they are, but also kind of a nuisance and sort of just, it's almost like a moral judgment, like they aren't respectable birds because you'll find them doing things like ripping open trash bags. You'll get this instance where this woman was trying to take a lovely bucolic country kind of photo, lighthouse in the background, classic Maine lobster roll in the foreground. And as she stretched out her arm and snapped the picture, this herring gull came and just gulped down her lobster roll. And so that's kind of their reputation, that if you try to go enjoy the beach, a gull is going to come and steal your food. And that's not respectable, and that's not how birds should be. And at its extreme, you can get like this guy up here who had a hamburger on the beach at Hampton, and this young herring gull, so this was a young of the year, not even a year-old bird, very possibly fledged off of Appledore, was just kind of walking around and sort of like begging for pieces of the hamburger. And it just made the guy so mad that he kicked the gull badly enough that the gull ended up dying. And enough people saw this and were disturbed by it that they reported him to the police and to Fish and Game, and people found him because his picture was all over social media, and he actually faced charges for this. Not that I think any animal should ever be kicked just for begging for food, but in terms of birds, most birds are federally protected, and you can't be doing anything like this. So you can get yourself into deep trouble. And people have a hard time thinking that way about gulls. They're like, whatever, they're as bad as pigeons. I'm also a pigeon lover, so I don't understand that either. But this is the perception, that they are common, that they are a nuisance, that there's too many of them, and that's why they're all up in people's faces. Because if there were the right number of gulls, then they wouldn't be bothering people so much. So that's what we run into as people's kind of common understanding of what the deal is with gulls. Then there's the reality as we see it on Appledore. I want to give the caveat that our trends on Appledore don't necessarily represent the trends for all gulls everywhere, or even through the Gulf of Maine, which is what we're really interested in. But our trends on Appledore are not that far off of other colonies of gulls. So this is the general picture. Some specifics of what has driven these changes on Appledore don't necessarily pertain to other islands. But this graph right here is a long-term census that's been going on, kind of having people go out into the colony, walk along, mark and count every single nest that they find in a subsection of the island. And by doing that in the same place at the same time every year, we can get a sense of how's the overall island population of gulls doing. So you can see these numbers go all the way back to 1997. And we've got two different colored lines here. We've got a dark blue that represents our herring gulls. And then we've got this kind of hot pink, then those are our Great Black-backed Gulls. What we're measuring in the numbers over here is the number of nests. So remember, each nest represents 2 adults, and typically they'll lay 3 eggs. Usually all 3 will hatch. Usually not all 3 will survive to fledge. So it's kind of a variable number of individual gulls that live in that nest or at that nest site, but it gives you a general sense. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the herring gulls, there were up around 400 nests on the island. And it's a small island, so it was very crowded with gulls. Great black-backed gulls were never as common, but still hovering around 150 nests. And that was pretty steady. Looked like maybe the herring gulls were even increasing during that time. You can see there's no line after this 2003 number. That just means that we missed a year or two. So we can't really draw a line that says, you know, this is continuous data. But the next time you see a dot, we've gone from almost 450 herring gull nests to 150. So the numbers of herring gulls nesting on Appledore Island crashed off of a cliff. The Great Black-backed Gulls, never as numerous, but they too crashed precipitously. So we're down to like 50 nests. And this was 2004, well, 2005. So there's a little note here that gives kind of the brief story, the kind of bloodless story. And this was actually a quite bloody story. In 2004, there was a lot of disturbance in the colony. People were noticing it. The gulls were getting really riled up. Something was deeply troubling them. And even worse, people were finding smashed eggs and dead chicks, and just evidence that something really catastrophic was happening. Julie Ellis, who started the program, she and a collaborator happened to be in one of the buildings on the island, and they heard this kind of messing around up in the eaves, and they were like, what is that sound? So they managed to put a camera up into kind of this little crawl space and snap a picture and then bring it down and look at what they had seen. And there was a family of raccoons in the building. So we don't know exactly what happened there, how the raccoons got onto the island. Best suspicion is that somebody on the mainland trapped them there and boated them out to Appledore, most likely deliberately to cause a pretty severe impact on the gull colony. So this is probably not a person who was very fond of gulls, and brought the raccoons out there hoping that they would kind of wipe them out. And they very nearly succeeded. So that year, 2004, when the raccoons were rampaging around the island, gulls don't have a lot of defense against them. The adult gulls can just jump up and fly away, but the babies, the chicks, and the eggs were defenseless. And the raccoons just ate pretty much every egg that they could get to. If they didn't eat the eggs, they ate the chicks soon after they hatched. They didn't seem to kill many, if any, adult gulls, but it was a pretty much complete failure of reproduction that year on the island. There were almost no gulls fledged off the island that year. So it was terrible. The raccoons were trapped. They were removed from the island, and everybody figured, well, that was a horrible loss, but adult gulls live a long time. They weren't killed by the raccoon. They come back to the same breeding island year after year. So those gulls should be back in 2005, 2006, 2007, and so on, breeding again. But what you see from the graph is you get into, we didn't have a census in 2006, but 2007, 2008, 2009, the herring gull line, you can see, just stays pretty steady. We get some dips even. So it certainly never went back to that level before the raccoons arrived. And we don't have a great explanation for that. The same thing happened with the blackbacks. They recovered a bit more. It looks like more of them came back, but we're not sure where those adults went. Normally, a gull will just keep breeding on the same island for many, many years, like pretty much its whole lifetime. So we can't say for certain that those, especially those missing herring gulls, didn't move to another island somewhere else in the Gulf of Maine or someplace completely different and start breeding there. We didn't have a lot of banded birds, really no banded birds at that point. So we can't track them and say, oh, well, those banded birds, they turned up breeding, way up in Labrador, or they turned up breeding, someplace in Massachusetts. We don't know that. So it may be that some of these gulls never bred anywhere again. It may be that some were happily breeding someplace else. It's hard not to speculate about what psychological impact this event must have had on them, that so many of them did not return to breed. I know if this had happened in my neighborhood, I would probably figure it's not a great place to raise kids, and I might never come back there again. So we're not sure. So it's not that I can say, it's not like I can say the raccoon came and killed all these adult herring gulls and now they're dead, and that's why these numbers are so much lower. But we don't know where they went, and they certainly are no longer breeding on Appledore. So the numbers never came all the way back up. And while we have this very dramatic story of a raccoon that we can point to a clear-cut case of this is what drove the decline in our gulls, the interesting thing is if you talk to other people working on other gull colonies between here and Labrador up in Canada, they're all seeing declines in the breeding population of gulls of both species. And some of them are seeing such severe declines that they've started talking like, are we watching kind of a slow motion catastrophe where birds that we have always thought were common just kind of disappear in plain sight because people think they're doing fine? You go to the beach, you see the gulls, you think if they're on their beach, there must be so many of them that they're overflowing into human habitats. That may not be the case. So there is evidence from, for instance, the UK that gulls that are seen in cities, so people there tend to figure, okay, if I'm seeing gulls in the city, that must mean there's so many gulls out in the wild that the city population is like an overflow population. Like there's too many gulls, and now they're expanding into new human habitats in order to breed. What they're finding in the UK is that those urban nesting gulls are really the only gulls that are doing well, and gulls are almost disappearing from wild colonies over there. And it may shift such that the only gulls they really have over there are the ones that are urban and are nesting on top of buildings. So there can be these shifts that we don't always attend to because we have this bias of thinking, if I see a lot of gulls at the beach, there must be a lot of gulls just in the world. And we know from evidence from the UK and increasingly from colonies up and down our own East Coast that that may not, in fact, be accurate. So when a decline is not due to something really cinematic like raccoons rampaging through the island, why would gull populations be declining up and down the Gulf of Maine, which we know they are? So there's a lot of speculation about that. Some of it hinges on not being able to say for sure what a normal number of gulls is. So, if you're going to talk about decline, then you're comparing that to some sort of baseline. And, you saw from our data back in the 90s, we had, 450 pairs of herring gulls. Can we say that that's kind of nature's expected number of herring gulls? And so a decline from that is a bad sign? not entirely. So what we know is that gull populations actually were increasing through the 70s and into the 90s, and then started declining. And we don't know where in there was sort of the natural number of gulls. People have pointed to things like landfills. Like, we used to have a lot more open landfills, which were just a buffet for gulls to feed off of. And so those landfills have gradually been covered over time since the 70s. So that certainly cut off a possible food source for gulls. And some people have pointed to that and said, well, maybe when we had all these open landfills, we actually artificially inflated the population of gulls. And so what we see after that is a natural correction. Possible that that's part of what's playing the role, but we can't actually say if the populations we saw in the 70s or the 90s were inflated or were unnaturally high. We don't know. Even on Appledore, it's hard to say. Before Europeans arrived, there was a land-based mammal, a swimming mammal, the sea mink, which was kind of like a weaselly otter kind of thing. And it could definitely swim out to the Isles of Shoals. And so as long as there were sea mink, they would just eat every egg and every chick. So it's probably not likely that any gulls nested on Appledore Island until Europeans came and they drove the sea mink to extinction through the fur trade. And then once the sea mink was gone, the gulls could move in. So even on Appledore, it's like, well, what's a normal number of gulls for Appledore? I don't know. So landfills may have played a role. Similarly, if you've ever watched a fishing boat, lobster boat, you know gulls follow in this plume that just stretches out behind it because it's an easy food source. They're always throwing off discards and chum and old bait and things like that. And so the gulls definitely feed off of those discards. As some fisheries are restricted or closed, do we see the same phenomenon as with the landfills where gulls were relying on this human-generated food source, and as you take that away, they may not do as well? And then we've got a whole panoply of other threats that we know kind of face seabirds generally. Gulls are seabirds that are similar in some ways to some of these other birds and different in others. But we know something like human disturbance, habitat loss, and climate change for certain are going to be expected to impact gulls as well. So there's all these forces kind of coming down on them from different directions. And it's hard to pinpoint where exactly one factor starts and another one ends. So there's no clear answer on that, but there are some pretty tantalizing things out of some really interesting research that's been done. I give this example, it's not the only one, but getting at that question of fisheries and how much are gulls kind of getting this artificial bonus food from humans when they follow fishing boats, when they follow lobster boats. So in Canada, in Eastern Canada, in the Maritimes, in 1992, the cod fishery had collapsed so badly that the Canadian government put out a complete moratorium on ground fishing. So the kind of fishing that you would do for cod, to the extent that those boats could not leave the harbor. They were not going out at all. This was not a reduction in fisheries. This was a complete cessation to try and give the cod a chance to recover. So a group of scientists in Canada thought, okay, this isn't not a deliberate experiment, but oh, there's like somebody's writing on my screen. That's very weird. It's mysterious. So these scientists figured, all right, this is happening. Why don't we try to get as much data from it as we can, since it's going to happen anyway? And so they were interested in this question of how do fisheries impact seabirds? And they weren't just interested in gulls. They were interested in a broad range of seabirds. And they had this suspicion that keeping all these fishing boats in the harbor might not have the same impact on every kind of seabird. So they picked a few different species to look at. They picked 3 different gulls, so great black-backed gulls, herring gulls, the same ones that nest on Appledore, and a third kind of gull called the black-legged kittiwake. And then they also looked at 3, so you may have heard of Atlantic puffins, those clownish-looking, adorable little guys. Related to the puffin are razorbills and murres. So those are 3 kinds of seabirds that make their livings quite differently than gulls. Gulls and these 3, the puffin, the razorbill, and the murre, they're called alcids. So alcids, they fish for a living. Gulls can also eat fish for a living, but the alcids dive underwater. And if you've ever watched footage of like a penguin fishing, they like flap their little flippers and they look like they're flying underwater. Alcids do that too. So you can see a little cartoon here. This is kind of what alcids look like. They almost look like little penguins. And you can see it's got its wings up and it's actually showing it the way it swims underwater. So these guys can dive pretty deep pursuing fish. And then you've got the gulls, and they can eat fish, but they have a hard time getting under the water. When you watch them kind of try to jump into the water, they're so buoyant that they can get like 6 inches down and then they're like, whoop, bobbing back up to the surface. So they cannot swim for prolonged periods under the water chasing fish like the alcids can. So they picked these two different groups, figuring that those two different strategies might mean that these birds interact differently with the nets that these fisheries are putting in the water. And so the thought was, if you are an alcid where you swim under the water chasing fish, if there's a net down there submerged in the water, you may get tangled in that net. And that's bad news for you. You were just trying to go about your business, catching fish, and you got stuck in a net and then you drown. Gulls can't really get that deep in the water. So it's not really expected that they would get entangled in the nets all that often because they just can't really get that far under the water. So when they ran the numbers on this graph on the left here, there's this dotted line in the middle, and there are these dots. So this dot is the Great Black-backed Gull data, this is the herring gull data, and this is the kittiwake data. I'm not talking about gannets. They're another type of bird that's not really related to this story. And then the three alcids are these blue dots. So the dotted line represents, if a dot were to appear on that line, it would mean that the population of that species of bird didn't change at all after the moratorium went into effect. The birds didn't do better, they didn't do worse, their population stayed exactly the same. If a dot appears above this dotted line, it means their numbers grew. So their population grew when the fishery was shut down in Canada. So you can see for the three species of alcids, the blue dots are all well above that dotted line. Just as we might expect, all three of those species did better once those nets were not in the water anymore. They were free to just fish without having to worry about being entangled. They weren't being drowned by these fishing nets. But if you look at the story for gulls, these three red dots are the gull species, and they are well below this dotted line. So when a dot appears below the dotted line, it means that population of that species declined after the moratorium. So once those fishing nets were out of the water, the gulls didn't do so well. Their populations declined. So this is kind of a natural experiment in a way, kind of an inadvertent experiment that does seem to lend credence to the idea that gulls do actually rely on fisheries waste on following fishing boats. That is complicated, though, by the fact that before people came along with all of their fishing boats, gulls had more fish in the ocean to catch. Humans, the reason this moratorium went into effect is because we have overfished the oceans. So can we really say, even with the gulls, that we're seeing them taking an unnatural amount of food from fisheries, from discards and old bait and things like that? Or have they kind of had to move from fishing for themselves naturally to taking these fisheries discards because we are the same humans that removed all these fish from the sea and left them with less to eat? So it's a complicated story, but this was a really elegant way of kind of getting at that idea. And it does point to how we can't ever make broad statements about what either helps all seabirds or hurts all seabirds, because seabirds are so diverse and they make their livings in such different ways, and their interactions with humans can come in different forms. And some benefit more from humans and some are harmed more by humans. So this is a very texty heavy slide. I don't intend for you to read all of that text, but this just gets to kind of the flip side of gulls being so closely associated with humans. So we do know they feed at landfills. We do know they follow fishing vessels. We do know they do worse when there's less fishing going on. But this was a notice from 2019. There was a really bad red tide event. So the shellfish beds from Gloucester up to Salisbury were all closed. You couldn't go clamming or any of those things. And there were all these notices, and humans can read notices. Gulls don't read notices all that well. So what we saw on Appledore that year, there's a picture here, and this at first glance doesn't look that different from the nesting gull picture. You know, you go to Appledore, you expect to see gulls sitting on the ground. That's where they're on their eggs. That's where they're tending their babies. But this one of our volunteers, Dan Walton, took this picture and came back to us after he'd been out for a walk in a kind of a remote part of the island. Whoa, I don't know why there's like writing showing up on my screen. It's like someone is like drawing on it, I guess. So if anybody's like gesturing at the screen with their mouse or something, just like, I guess don't. I don't know what's showing up. If it gets really bad, I'll just stop sharing and I'll reshare, and I think that'll work. But for right now, I'll just leave it. So this, if you can see a little bit of the detail here on the breast of this bird, there's a bunch of mud. And what Dan Walton told us when he got back to campus on Appledore was that this gull had been not able to stand and was hauling itself around by its wings and was completely paralyzed through its legs. And this was not the only one we saw like this. There were several adult gulls that year that were showing clear signs of paralysis. And we don't have clear-cut evidence of this, so it's actually notoriously difficult to diagnose this, like a red tide shellfish poisoning kind of event, because by the time you get the body in, there's often no sign of the toxin left in the body. So we did collect some of these birds. This picture over here is me carrying that same bird after I euthanized it, because it was clear it was just going to suffer. And we brought it back and did a necropsy, it's an animal autopsy. Didn't really see any signs of illness otherwise. We did submit some tissues for testing through the UNH lab. They were like, yeah, we don't see anything, but that does not rule out red tide. It's probably our best bet since it was such a bad year for it. So this really alarms us when things like this happen, because gulls can live such a long time that when you lose an adult gull from the population, that's a severe loss, because that bird could have had another decade, 2 decades of raising babies on the island and contributing to the population, and losing them is a real challenge. So we can't say definitively that happened, but the reason I raise this as kind of a counterpoint to gulls seeming to do very well alongside humans is their fates are tied to our fates in this way, and they make their livings in very similar places as we do. And with something like red tide, we expect those events to get longer duration, more severe, and more frequent with climate change, because some of the species of algae that cause these events really thrive in warmer waters, and the Gulf of Maine is warming extremely fast. So we expect these kinds of losses to keep happening more and more, and it really does worry us. So we are interested in these kind of population level questions about gulls, as many scientists are. But we have the advantage on Appledore of having this long-term banding project where we know individual birds pretty well. In some cases, we banded them as babies and we can follow them through their entire lifespan, at least the parts of it that they spend on Appledore. So we've gotten very interested in these perceptions of gulls, what people think about gulls, what they assume about them. And this is small text again, but the headline of this, getting to the bottom of gulls' attitude problem. So are gulls just jerks, plain and simple? So that's quite the lead on a news story. But this was an interview with Steve Kress, who is in charge of, our founder of Project Puffin. And he was talking about his work with terns and how gulls can be a threat to terns. And we have some endangered tern species here in New Hampshire and Maine that we have to worry about, that need to be very fiercely protected if they're going to have any chance. And so the idea that gulls will do things like attack and kill terns, that's alarming. So Kress refers to gulls as adaptive generalist birds, and that is commonly how they're referred to. And that just means that they can make their living in a lot of different ways. They can eat a lot of different things. They can eat French fries, they can eat fish, they can eat baby terns. So the question is, and what we're interested in particularly, is is each individual gull like that? Like, is every individual gull an opportunist and will just take any kind of food that comes its way, and it might go fishing one day and it might eat French fries another day? Or are they more kind of individual than that? And so there are many studies, especially in herring gulls, that center on that question of just how specialized does an individual gull get? Or does every individual gull just kind of like, yeah, whatever comes up in the buffet today, I'll eat it. And then, are they just jerks, plain and simple? Which, I mean, spoiler alert, it's not my opinion of my beloved friends on Appledore. So this little montage here is just getting at the variety of things that gulls can eat, and starts to get us into this territory of, all right, does every gull kind of eat all of these things? Or does each gull kind of develop a niche and a specialization in certain kinds of food, or is it somewhere in between? So to the question of eating terns, yes, it does happen. So this picture down here, this is a pair of bands. So you can see the metal one here. So generally when we ban these birds, we place a metal band on one leg that's issued by the federal government, and then we place a more legible, easier to see band on the other leg. And so this pair of bands was from a young tern. So Appledore sits in this archipelago, the Isles of Shoals. And on White and Seavey Islands, there is a tern colony that includes multiple species of terns, one of which is endangered. And so these bands turned up, pun intended, on Appledore in a very remote part of the island where almost nobody ever goes. And the only reason we found these bands is because my sister and I were out trying to map every single nest on the island, which we try to do every year. And so we have to go to even the weirdest crevices and the most poison ivy infested rock faces. And in one spot on the island, we found a pile of these bands. And we found a whole pile of tern bones and tern feathers. And it was clear from that that there was a gull that lived specifically in that remote part of Appledore Island that had specialized on baby terns and was going over to the tern colony pretty much every day and seizing a few terns to eat and coming back to Appledore and digesting what it could and then regurgitating the undigestible bits like the bands and the bones. But what's interesting is that is the only place on the island where we ever found that. So it was clear to us that there was one gull that had gotten really good at raiding the tern colony and eating those babies. There were plenty of other gulls around that were aware of the tern colony, but they weren't specialized in that. And it might seem like it would be easy pickings because terns are so much smaller than gulls. But I have visited a tern colony and it is a cacophony, and they dive bomb at you and they peck your head, and they'll certainly do the same thing to a marauding gull. So it wouldn't be the easiest way to make a living, but with anything, the more you practice it, the more you get better at it. So this particular gull had been practicing and had gotten really good at feeding on baby terns. That's not something we commonly see. Even though the islands are so close to each other, most of the gulls don't go over there and try to eat terns. This, whoops, let me go back. No. Oh my God, you're getting a crazy preview. This was a whole squid that one of our great black-backed gulls regurgitated as we captured it to band it. And at that particular nest, it was clear that that great black-backed gull was mainly fishing for itself, was going out to sea and catching things like whole fresh squid and bringing them back to its offspring. So with a lot of the great black-backed gulls in particular, they tend to be more marine oriented. They tend to do more fishing rather than terrestrial feeding. But we've also got, because these gulls kind of yak up these pellets of the undigestible parts of their food, we find plenty of gull pellets that are exclusively insect parts. And you wouldn't think you'd be able to sustain a gull body on flying ants and wasps and things like that. But it appears that some of these gulls, again, get practiced enough that they can kind of mow down these clouds of insects and at least make part of their living off of that. And then finally, I have this one. The last time I gave this talk, there was like this kind of like sad sigh when I explained what we were looking at. This is a bit of rose-breasted grosbeak, a lovely songbird that a gull had eaten and just torn apart. And that's not an easy thing to do either. So to catch an adult songbird on the wing or to ambush it when it's in a shrub, that's not an easy thing to do. So this isn't a common thing that we find, but there are certain gulls that get good enough at that they will pick off adult songbirds. We had another gull regurgitate a flycatcher one time that it had caught on the wing, apparently. So again, as with anything any of us tries to learn, we're often not very good at it until we've done it many, many times. And so we see evidence that individual gulls do that. They kind of pick a specialty and they practice it and practice it and practice it. Certainly there are some gulls that just kind of make their livings more generally and will kind of feed from multiple different sources as they're available. But even if you think about feeding on a beach and trying to steal food from humans, not every gull is going to be inclined toward that because some gulls are just much more wary of humans. And you have to get pretty close to a person to steal. We got a report from one of our banded gulls where this woman said she had set a piece of banana bread on a Tupperware right next to her. And one of our banded gulls came down and gulped it down. And she was pretty furious, but she said that her son declared that the gull was our very good friend. So if you're going to be a very good friend gull and eat banana bread, and you're going to go right up close to people to steal it, that takes a certain kind of boldness. And so what we see more and more, not just in our gull studies, but across animal studies, is there's a lot of evidence that animals have just as much personality variation as we do. So some humans are bold and risk-taking, and some are much more reclining and shy and nervous. And that's kind of what we see here. So we can see evidence of that in what kinds of foods they're willing to pursue and what kinds of foods they tend to specialize in. So in order to know this about individual birds, we have to ban them because we're not very good at recognizing their individual faces. So we have to place something on them so that we can say, that's that same bird from yesterday, or that's the same bird from last year. So as with the tern bands I showed you, we placed 2 different bands on each bird. Our silver colored federal band that is pretty much illegible unless you have a scope and the bird stays very still. And then these big honking huge black and white bands that go on the other leg that if a bird were to say steal your banana bread, you could read with the naked eye when it got close enough. Certainly you can read them with binoculars if the bird gets remotely close. These plastic bands, they're made out of PVC and they are expensive. They're like $6 a piece, but they're worth it because this is how we get our stories about where these birds spend their time. So I will say this many times in the time we have remaining. You, members of the public, community scientists, you are how we know where these birds go. These birds are only on Appledore for a short period of time, and then they disperse and they go out into the world. And so when we ban them, it's like throwing a message in a bottle out into sea and hoping somebody finds it and hoping somebody writes back. So I gave this talk at one library, and the librarian there said, "Oh, I've seen your banded birds, but I just figured, those are science birds. So they have these bands on, but they're probably also like wearing a GPS logger or something." And so she just figured there was no role for her. So ever since then, I was like, oh my God, I need everybody to know that if you see a bird that's wearing these bands, there is no other way we're going to know about it than if you tell us. So literally, we've ever had GPS loggers on 5 birds, and we have banded 4,000 plus birds. So the vast majority of our data just comes from people being like, a bird stole my banana bread. I'm kind of mad, but I also want to know its story. So here's its band number. That's where this whole project, that's what it's built around. So that's a lot of work, putting these bands on the birds, but the payoff comes when members of the public tell us that they've seen them. So I'm going to give you the information at the end on how to let us know if you've seen a banded bird. And I encourage everybody to go out and treasure hunt for them because it's the best hobby and it's the most fun. So in order to have these birds out there for you to see, we have to catch the birds and we have to put the bands on them. And that is intimidating and dirty and labor intensive. This is one of our students, Franciel, came out a few years, and he's in proper protective gear because the gulls, when you are messing with them, messing with their babies, they rightly defend their babies, and they will fly up above you and drop down from the sky and conk you in the head. And we had a student one year who got a concussion bad enough from an impact like that she had to be taken off the island. So ever since then, we take safety incredibly seriously, and everybody who works with the gulls has to wear a helmet. And we try to disturb the gulls as little as possible, but obviously we are a major disturbance. So we take a fairly big team out. It takes a lot of people to be out in the field catching gulls and bringing them in and putting the bands on and taking samples. So we banned 2 different groups of gulls. We banned both the adults. So those are the ones that are at least 4 years old, and they're on Appledore Island to breed, to raise their young. And we also banned fledglings. So the babies that hatch that year, they grow by the time we're in mid-July to be big enough just about to fly. So that's what we mean by fledglings. So we go twice during the summer. We go out in May to band adults, and we go out in July to ban the fledglings. Banding the adults, so there's trade-offs here. Banding the adults is time-consuming, extremely frustrating, and cartoonishly ridiculous. The way we do it, this box here, you can see it's made out of rebar and covered in chicken wire. And you can see a wary looking gull in the background. What we do with this box, and the reason why it looks like it's on its side, is because we take the box and we put a stick propping the box up, and we tie a string to the stick, and then we unravel the string and we go hide in a shrub, and we wait for the gull to go under the box, which it usually will because we've propped the box above its nest. And they feel such a drive to get back on those eggs and incubate them and keep them safe that even if they're like, this box looks kind of sketchy and I don't like it, but I got to get on the nest, they'll go under the box, they'll sit on the nest, and then we pull the string and the stick flies out and the box falls in this like very Wile E. Coyote type of science. But it is documented and it's real, and we have all the permits that we need in order to do this very serious science. But that means it takes a lot of time to catch an adult gull. And a lot of them will just sit there and look at you like, there's no way I'm going under there. So we don't catch a lot of adults in a given year. Maybe 25 to 30 would be really good for us. But the reason we keep doing it is because we know that they're probably going to be back the next year. So if a gull makes it to adulthood and shows up on Appledore Island to breed, from our numbers, there's about an 80% chance that that bird will be back the next year to breed again. And then there'll be an 80% chance the year after that it'll come back. So if you band an adult bird, there's a really good shot that you will get multiple years of data on where it spends its time and where it travels. So we get this excellent year-over-year history on the bird, but we don't get a lot of birds banded that way. The other frustrating thing about that is we don't know how old they are. All you can tell about a gull is it 4 years old or older than that? But they age really gracefully. So you can't really tell if a gull is 4 years old or 34 years old. So we don't know. We just know it was banded as an adult. So that can be frustrating for answering certain kinds of questions. So we come back in July, do the flip side of this, and we catch a bunch of baby birds, fledglings. They're just about as big as the adults, but they can't fly yet. So with these guys, we don't need the trap. We just run around. If you've ever caught chickens in a barnyard, it looks very much like that. We just run around and we just catch them with our hands, and we can band a lot of gulls that way. So in a week, we can band hundreds of gulls if we want to try for that. So we get large numbers. We know how old they are because we know they hatched that year. We often know who their parents are because we try to focus on the fledglings of our banded birds to kind of get family units. But the flip side of this is that they don't tend to live. So not a lot of these fledglings will live to be adults. And so a lot of these bands we put out into the world, we never hear from that bird again. It probably dies that first year. And so it's a lot of effort for not a lot of resighting and return. So we try to balance it by doing some of each activity. And we hope that we get kind of a quasi-complete picture by emphasizing both of those. So once the bands are on, we wait, and hopefully people tell us that they've seen them. And some of these banded gulls are a treasure trove of this kind of data. So one of our most famous ones, 2E2, this is a bird that breeds on Appledore and spends almost all of the rest of its time on Plum Island. And so many, many people see it. It's very conspicuous. It just kind of patrols the beach all day. And what we get, so if you see one of our banded birds, at a minimum, you can go to our website and say, I saw 2E2 on this date on Plum Island. But what's great for us is if we also get pictures and if we also get descriptions of what the bird was up to. So in the case of 2E2, we've now amassed a real trove of images and stories about how it spends its time and what it eats. So in terms of what it eats, you can see here it's carrying this big clam. So sometimes it eats shellfish. Here it's eating a skate. So it'll kind of catch fish, things like that at the water's edge. This is this gruesome, bloody beaked, totally death metal image of 2E2 was because he found a dead seal down the beach and was just like eyeballs deep in the dead seal and had just gone to go wash itself off. So he'll scavenge, he'll fish, he'll go for shellfish. Here he found a picnic that he figured was unattended. So he was sticking his beak into a cooler. Unbeknownst to him, under this towel is a human woman who was taking a little bit of a nap. And when she heard him rummaging, she thought her husband had come back. So she tossed her towel off, and you could see the guy who was observing this, he's like, you could just see this moment where they had the exact same experience of like deep startle. And they both sort of leapt backwards from each other. And 2E2 was like, I don't mess with people. I don't like to be that close to people. I like to steal unattended picnics. So he raced off down the beach. So this is a generalist gull. This is a gull that will eat pretty much anything and is very opportunistic and kind of fits that picture of gulls will kind of eat whatever. So we have a lot of information on what he does, how he spends his time, and what he eats. Unfortunately, not all the birds are as cooperative, and not all of them are as pleased to have their picture taken or to even be seen by human eyes. So we have had the opportunity, we got a grant to place a small number of little GPS logger backpacks. So you can see here, I'm holding this gull, and at the base of his back, we've placed this little solar powered GPS logger that he wears like a little backpack. And then we release him. And every time he comes back to Appledore, he pings this little base station and we get a readout on where he has spent his time. So we targeted these on gulls that had been banded for a while, but had never been seen by a person. And sure enough, once we got the data back, so Appledore is kind of under this cluster here, and each of these push pins was a location where he had spent some time. And you can see Portsmouth is over here. He had gone to the mainland a few times, but most of the time, like pretty much every day's data showed him doing these loops out to sea. We don't know exactly what he was doing. Like, was he fishing for himself? Was he following a fishing boat? Was he sitting on a lobster boat? But we do know at least why people on the mainland weren't seeing him. So this is, again, the gulls are individuals. Some of them are very happy to spend their time on the mainland, and others don't want anything to do with it. And when they're not breeding on Appledore, they are out at sea, and they are very much marine seabirds. So that's the expensive way to deal with kind of camera shy, human shy gulls. But we also sometimes get unexpected reports from birds that we figured we would never see again. So this one, L99, one of our herring gulls, we had banded it in 2011, didn't hear anything for years. Nobody saw it anywhere. And then in 2018, a lobsterman named Brad Natty sent us a picture and said, this gull's been on my boat pretty much every day. I feed her fish. She's my friend. And this is where she spends her time. So once we were in touch with him, he was sending us constant reports on what she was doing. So sometimes it's just getting information about our project to the right people who are seeing our gulls, but just don't know like that they're supposed to report them, don't know who we are, don't think to look it up. Totally understandable. And same thing for, this was a birder who happened to see one of our gulls in Kennebunk, also hadn't been seen since it was banded in 2011, turned up in Kennebunk in 2018. Don't know if it was in Kennebunk the whole time, or maybe it had spent its time elsewhere and just was moving there. So we get these gaps in our data that do frustrate us. So the more we can spread the word so that more people know if they see a band like this, it is not information that we already have. If you tell us where you see it and what it was up to, we will we will praise you to the heavens. So the other thing that we can do with these band resightings, when people who have seen the birds observe them, we can, if people share with us kind of the stories that they're observing, we can get a sense of more of the gull's whole life. So we've got this pair of gulls. So here's an example. This person saw one of our gulls and she included a note with her report and said, this gull was very respected by the other gulls, looked very happy and clean, not bothered by people. And sometimes it's just a little note like that we just love getting. And then this one, Kaya Walker, who worked on the National Wildlife Refuge in Plum Island, she would see our gulls from time to time. And she sent us this picture along with a note that said, sharing clams. I'd be very surprised if M99 and Z09 weren't a mated pair. Why else would they bring each other food like that, especially in consecutive years? Very interesting. And we're like, that is interesting. And it drove home for us why getting photos and reports like that from the public is worth way more than we ever thought. Because if Kaya had just reported that she saw M99 and Z09 on the same beach on the same day, we wouldn't know that they had any relationship to each other. They could just have happened to be there at the same time. The fact that she sent us this picture where they're clearly feeding on the same food and standing very close together, and she's absolutely right that that was mating behavior. It's clear that they were a mated pair, and without the photo in her report, we wouldn't have known. We would just know they were both alive and on that beach at the same time. So since then, we've really tried to emphasize to people that it's not like a frivolous little thing if you share a photo or you share a story. That's how we put together their life histories. In the case of those two, Z09, Kaya actually found floating dead a week or so later. And then M99, the mate, was found on Appledore. Mary Elizabeth and I were out doing some work and we found this gull that had a fishing hook through its bill, and then the fishing line attached to it had wrapped around a shrub and had trapped this bird. And so it had died there. And so that was like a week later. So it was only like 2 weeks after Kaya had seen these two sharing clams, clearly setting up housekeeping, ready to head out to Appledore to raise the year's young. They were both dead. And in the case of M99, we know exactly why. It was human induced. So this is the flip side of making your living right alongside humans. Sometimes it means a free meal and sometimes it means death. So we don't know why Z09 died. We weren't able to determine that. And this is always hard for us to see, but at the same time, seeing these birds all the way through their lifespan and knowing so much, I mean, we still have frustrating gaps in our knowledge, but knowing so much about them as individuals and how they fit into their gull society and who their neighbors are and who their mates are, and who their children are, that is intensely valuable to us. So we get information about their family structures this way. This is also from Plum Island. This is 2E2 way off in the distance circled. this was his mate from that year, and this was their baby from that year. So this was how we knew that 2E2 and his mate tend to provide extended care to their offspring. Not every gull pair does that. Some are just like, listen, I fed you enough. You're not living in my basement anymore. I'm leaving. It's the end of summer. Goodbye. And then some of them do this and are like, okay, we're all leaving the island together. We're going to fly you over to Plum Island and we're going to teach you how to eat dead seals and eat skates and steal picnics and whatever it is. So that's individual. Not every gull provides that kind of care. And what's really cool is there's some tantalizing things here where 2AK, another banded gull, we suspect, we cannot fully confirm because our data just aren't quite that good. We think 2AK is one of 2E2 and his mate's babies from a previous year. And he was being allowed to hang out and sometimes even share food. So it looks like not only were they providing what we consider extended care to this year's baby, but like the teenager from previous years was being allowed to kind of tag along and benefit from their wisdom and their instruction. And that's not something that necessarily every gull is going to do, but when it happens, it points to this individual variation that we're really curious about and these family structures that we want to know about. So that's the basics of the Gull project. Kind of the twin mission that we have, that we share with Shoals Marine Lab, is to educate undergraduates specifically in field science. And I have the benefit of working at a community college where our students often don't get access to research opportunities because we don't have research labs at a community college. And so a lot of our students would benefit profoundly from an internship or a field experience, and they can't get access to it. So being able to bring them to Appledore and have them work with the gulls is incredibly valuable. So I've got some students of mine here. This is Sarah and Suri and Luis and Molly, and they were out for short periods to help us with the banding. This is Amisha and David. They were actually on island for a full 10-week summer internship, working with the gulls every day. And I just heard from David, he's transferring to another college and he just got a job at a research lab. So it's just like seeing them kind of launch and sort of like fledge in a scientific way has been really deeply rewarding for us. So I leave this, I will go, I have one more slide with the contact information for how to reach us and how to tell us if you see our banded birds, but I do want to make a shameless plea for money and or time. So I phrase it that way because we do have to assemble these teams of volunteers to help us band the birds. And so we try to take mainly undergraduates. I actually have taken middle school students, high school students from Lawrence and the surrounding area. So we try to take students for that. And that's because we have limited funds. And so we want our limited funds to go to supporting those students in gaining this opportunity. But we also take volunteers, especially volunteers that can pay their own way. That kind of volunteer we're all about. So in order to join us on island, the island is run by the Shoals Marine Laboratory. And you can go out there as any member of the public, and you can even stay overnight. So the fee for just kind of a person from the public who wants to check out the island or help us with our project is about $200. It's not a bad deal because it covers your boat out there and your overnight accommodations and all your food, and the food is delicious. And so we take volunteers to help us with that because we need bodies to catch birds with us. The free part of volunteering is what I've been emphasizing with the resighting. Just out in and about in your travels, going to the beach, going to have a picnic. If you see our birds, please tell us. If you can snap a picture, awesome. If you can tell us a story about what they were doing when you saw them, awesome. It's invaluable. And then donations in terms of funds, it's exclusively through donations that we run this project. Nobody is getting paid to do it. It's not supported by any institution. My college can't afford to support it. So it's only because people believe in this and send us money to support it that we can do it. It costs us about $10,000 a year in a normal year to bring enough students out to band both in the May and July weeks. So that's all donations. And then to do these summer internships, that we have to come up with $5,000 per intern per summer. And that is a really cool synergistic project through Shoals Marine Lab where, you know, we run the banding part and we kind of facilitate part of the project. But Shoals provides like scientists in residence and assistance with statistics and helping the students work up their own data and, you know, kind of presentation skills and communication skills. So that's something that we've gotten really committed to, but obviously it's not cheap. So these are various ways that you can contribute time, energy, money. And if you do nothing but keep your eyes peeled for banded birds, I will like totally love you forever. So that leaves me, I'm going to leave this slide up because this is the how to find us slide. And then I'll see if anybody has any questions. If you see our birds, so that's the most important thing, you can report them on our website. So I've got our address here, gullsofappledore.wordpress.com. And we've got a little tab that says report abandoned gull. You click on that, it opens a quick form. You say where you saw it. If you took pictures, you email them to us, and you can reach us that way. Plenty of other information about the project, the gulls, all of that there. I've got the Shoals Marine Lab website up there. If you're interested in coming out to the island, that's where you'd go to figure out like, how does this work and how would I make my way there? And then my personal information, if you want to reach out to me for any reason, if you happen to be on Twitter, I try to post a considerable amount about Gulls of Appledore. I post more about Gulls of Appledore than my own children, which is telling, but I think my teens probably appreciate that. So I hope to hear from some or many or all of you very soon with banded gull reports. And I just want to thank you all and thank the Portsmouth Library again for this opportunity. This is such a rich area to try to reach public community scientists to aid us in this endeavor. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. I didn't know hardly anything about seagulls, and I definitely will report any that I see out and about. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, no, feel free. Everyone can unmute themselves if they'd like. If you have a question or type it in the chat.
I have a question. Why do some people call them seagulls, but you call them gulls?
So if you kind of talk to the wrong person who's a real pedantic birder type, they will insist that you only use the term gull. And I've never really understood the hostility to the term seagull. It seems to be based around the fact that seagull implies they all live on the ocean, and they don't. So there are many different species of gull, and some of them are much more inland oriented. So like ring-billed gulls, they're like cute little gulls that you'll often see in parking lots and by the Burger King and stuff like that. They will live much farther inland. We also have plenty of gulls that never go to the ocean that live like around the Great Lakes. So those are literally not seagulls. So that seems to be the main objection. But the level of pedantry around that actually drives me nuts, because I find that what ends up happening is when somebody says like, hey, I was curious about this seagull I saw, there's a lot of people, and not everybody's like this, but there are many people in the birding community to be like, well, actually, it's a gull. And to me, what that's going to do is just turn people off and just be like, I was just curious about what that bird was doing. Like, so I don't ever correct anybody for that. Like, I'm fine with the term seagull, especially since our Gulls of Appledore literally live by the sea. So they are gulls of the sea. But yeah, if you want to be like technically correct, and if you're worried that you might be talking to like a bird nerd pedant, saying gulls will get you in their good graces and they will smile upon you approvingly, and then they might answer your question.
Okay, we have a question from Karen Benoit, who's wondering how easy or hard is it to see the number on the band?
So I would say, so with the naked eye, like if you're just sitting on the beach and you don't have binoculars, if they're within 25 feet or so, you can see the band. So for gulls that are kind of comfortable around humans and are frequenting the beach, you don't even need binoculars. When we go, like kind of like if we're purposely looking for gulls, even just an ordinary pair of binoculars can get us to see whatever we need to see, because these bands are purpose built to be really in your face. So if you have just like, you don't need one of those big fancy spotting scopes that some birders have, just like whatever, some Walmart binoculars will do the trick. So even if you were like, I want to go out and specifically look for banded birds, what kind of equipment am I going to need? If you have even a cheap pair of binoculars, you'll generally be able to read our bands, like even at a fair distance, because we invest in these like highly legible, like billboard size bands.
Okay. And Jamie is wondering, what is the furthest location you've gotten a report of an Appledore gull from?
If I'm not mistaken, this might be a gullumnus, which is what we call former members of our team. So if it is you, hi, Jamie. So the farthest we've ever gotten a report So it's kind of a mix because the gulls tend to travel farther away when they're young. They kind of do some like sowing your wild oats, traveling the world. So we tend to see it being our young gulls that are the most far afield. And the farthest reports we've ever gotten were, we got one from Indiana. We've gotten some from Texas. We got one from Mexico. We certainly get them from all over the Great Lakes. So that gives you a sense of how, kind of a broad arc that you can draw and have a banded bird turn up there. As they get older, they tend to contract their range a bit. Again, individual gulls can vary, but they tend to stay a bit closer to Appledore even during the winter. So we won't see them as far away. But like our young gulls turn up in Florida all the time. It's like spring break, brazier all the time with gulls. So they're there. And the adults don't tend to go to Florida as much. They seem to get wise to like that not being the best place to hang out.
Oh, someone I think meant to message everyone, but just sent that to me. Is it okay to feed the gulls or is that discouraged?
So this becomes a broader question. Some of you may have seen this thing where recently in New England, the wildlife authorities were telling people to take down their bird feeders because there was concern that this fatal disease in songbirds might be marching up into New England and might start to affect our birds. And so this gets to the gulls because when we see a disease spreading, one of the best ways to keep that disease from spreading is to not have the birds congregate all together. Because just like we've learned from this pandemic, if you keep individuals apart from each other, there's less chance for them to kind of cross-pollinate in terms of these pathogens. So just in terms of things like disease susceptibility, we don't really want people feeding them because it'll draw a lot of birds to a single place where they wouldn't naturally gather. I think my biggest concern with feeding the birds is they become comfortable with humans because they associate humans with getting food, and not all humans are kind to them. So then we end up having a situation where one person was trying to be nice and was throwing French fries to a gull, and then that gull comes to learn that you should go to humans to try to get food, and then you have that guy on Hampton Beach that kicked the gull to death. So the more, and then we've also got just like gulls have a PR problem because they take food from people. They take food from people because people feed them food. So, we want it both ways. We want wildlife to come close to us, and we want to have that experience of being near a wild animal. And so I understand that instinct that people want to feed them so that they'll come in close. But we have to think about kind of the overall impact on the population. And we have this difficulty where people think these birds are a nuisance. They think they're pests. They think that they are things that steal your food. And the more we dissociate ourselves from a food source, the more the gulls can kind of like live their own lives, and we won't have as much of this conflict. So there's a lot of movement to look at human wildlife conflicts and try to alleviate those conflicts so that we fare better and the animals fare better. And so that's definitely where I come down on feeding the gulls. I actually am kind of ambivalent about even having like a bird feeder for songbirds in the yard. I go back and forth about that in my own yard. I've kind of threaded the needle on that by only feeding them in the winter, because in the summer, I just can't keep up with how clean you have to keep a bird feeder to keep the birds safe. And it's probably better to just like plant, plants that are good for birds, that they can find their own natural food. Put a pond in your yard, that's good for birds. Same thing with gulls. The best way to support them is to protect their habitat, protect the fisheries that they rely on, protect their natural food resources, and protect their breeding grounds, and kind of try to keep them from associating us with a food source for their own safety.
Okay. Nancy wants to know, do you find gulls might move to neighboring islands like Smutty Nose?
Yeah, so we've actually had occasional we consider them Appledore gulls, banded gulls, turn up breeding on Smutty Nose. So it happens not uncommonly that a fledgling that grew up on Appledore, fledged from Appledore, ends up breeding on Smutty Nose instead. We don't tend to see them breeding. It's hard to say, because unless there are eyeballs out there looking for banded birds, just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean the bird wasn't there. It's like if a tree falls in the forest, it's like if a banded bird turns up on an island and there's nobody there to spot it, was it really there? Yes, it was really there, but we'll never know. So Smutty Nose is a place where people will sometimes see our banded birds. So we do know that some Appledore gulls end up, just on the neighboring island. We've had our banded gulls turn up on Star Island, but Star Island is the one with the big hotel, and they're allowed to harass the gulls and keep them away. So gulls don't nest very well on Star, but we have had Appledore gulls, fledge on Appledore, grow up, come back and try to breed on Star. So it's not the case where once an Appledore gull, forever and always an Appledore gull. We don't really know for sure where they might go because there's just not a lot of people on some of the islands where gulls breed to tell us if our banded gulls are turning up in those places. But from the monitored colonies that are farther up towards Canada, they don't really get any of our banded Appledore gulls breeding on their islands. So it seems like it's kind of more constrained, that if you were reared as a baby on Appledore, you're probably not going to breed much farther afield than that.
Okay. Someone wants to know how the gulls are harassed on Star Island.
So it's a mixture of things. And I will say Star has all the permits they need in order to be able to do this. And mostly it's deterring the birds from ever trying to set up housekeeping there. So they can have dogs that they kind of walk around that scare the gulls away. Depending on what permits a place has, they can, like if a nest does get established, sometimes they can destroy the eggs. So I'm not sure exactly which controls Star may be doing in any given time. But certainly, I mean, just like, just kind of like disrupting the nest or having people walk through there, and then dogs is a very common one, to just make it an unpleasant place to be. So it's sort of all the opposites of the things that we try to do on Appledore, where when people come to Appledore, we try to make them understand, like, just give the birds a wide berth, don't bother them, try to kind of like walk sort of far away from them. We tell people not to make eye contact with the birds because that agitates them. Like they track human eye movements. There was a paper that came out recently that showed that if you walk within like 2 feet of a nesting seabird, but you're looking away from it, it will stay pretty chill. If you turn and look right at it with your predatory human stare, it will get all amped up. So they are watching us very carefully and they're reading our faces. And so even, if you're trying to harass gulls, sometimes it's something as subtle as that. You just like walk through there and you're just like, get out of here. And you stare it down. And then it's like, you know what? I'm going to go someplace nicer. I'm going to move to Appledore.
Okay. Abby wants to know, are the government issued bans used for something else specific, something other than what you use the like visible bands that you put on them for?
That's a really good question. So I have a federally issued banding permit. And so that means any bird that I catch and want to put any kind of marking on, I have to place a federal ban. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides those bans to us free of charge. But we have to place one on every bird, and we report back to the government what bans we placed, so that the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, has a record of every bird that is banded in America. So we have to do that. It's not that they're running specific studies on that. It's just that they are the overarching authority that tracks all of that. And if, for instance, somebody found, like one of our gulls died and somebody found just that metal band, they could actually, the website and the phone number for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is printed on that band. So they could call or write in and say, I found this band. And then the feds would let us know that one of our birds was found. So the readable PVC bands are what we're really interested in because that's what lets people see our birds. But the federal band is just required by, it's a condition of having a master banding permit.
I have another question. So we had Isles of Shoals historian Ann Beatty come and give us a talk a few months ago, and she had mentioned, I think it was the Appledore fishing village, and how the people there were capturing seagulls and eating them. And I was just wondering if you know anything about that, and if you have any sort of historical data, if it affected, the bird numbers at all. And also, have you heard of anyone in modern times eating a seagull, and is it a viable food source?
So that last part I will answer first. I've read reports of people eating gulls because they're so protected. Like you can't hunt them. You can't legally kill them really in any way unless you're euthanizing them. So there's very few opportunities for people to do it. I have read reports of people eating them. They report that the meat tastes a bit fishy. And then people who have eaten gull eggs, like fried them up or made an omelet, also report that it tastes vaguely fishy. which I actually find rather fishy, because as we look at these individual tastes, not every gull is eating fish. So to me, it seems like some of the eggs should taste more like French fries, and some should taste more like gross beaks and flycatchers, and some should taste like fish. Anyway, those are the reports I've heard. And from what I was actually working on a project kind of trying to answer these questions about historical uses of the island. I am not even remotely well versed in any of that. But as I was trying to look up just like, what evidence is there from the archipelago of how heavily used it was, I found like kind of some conflicting reports where like some of them were like, yeah, we did find, some evidence of like bones with, butcher marks on them and stuff, that people were clearly using these gulls as food a long time ago. It didn't seem like there was a heavy presence of that or a heavy reliance on that. What seems more likely, both from the reports that I read, and again, I could be saying stuff that like people who are expert in archaeology and history would be like, Sarah, you're nuts. But just from my cursory reading and from my experience on the island, it makes sense. What would have been more likely is that people would have eaten the eggs. So if they considered the archipelago, the Isles of Shoals, to be a good food source, it would have been because it's easy to just walk around on these ground nesting birds. And if you're willing to tolerate the birds attacking you from the sky, you can just pick up the eggs and use those as food. It's not easy to catch a fully flighted adult gull. Again, you could probably catch the chicks. I mean, we do too. You just run around before they can fly and grab them. But to me, if I had to choose, so if I were stranded on Appledore, my sister actually wrote a short story, like kind of horror genre, about being stranded on Appledore. So I've thought about it a lot. Like if I were stranded on Appledore and nobody lived there and I had to survive, like what would I do? I would definitely eat the eggs before I would eat the birds. They're pretty stringy and there's not a lot of meat on them. So it makes sense to me from what I've seen in the historical record that if they were used for food, it was mostly the eggs that were used.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, I think wanted everyone to know that phone-in band reporting doesn't seem to be supported by the banding lab anymore, and it's all through their website. So you can search for reported.
I was wondering about that. Yeah, it seemed like kind of an anachronism when I was looking at these bands. I'm like, I love that you can still call like 1-800-BIRD-BAND. So I was like, I wonder when that's going to go away. So it sounds like it has gone away.
Okay, and Jamie had another question. They were wondering, do other gulls come to Appledore or just herring and great black-backed?
So we get that question a lot because if you, like if you're in Portsmouth or you're in Hampton or one of the places very close to Appledore, you'll see great black-backed gulls on the beach, you'll see herring gulls on the beach, but you'll also see ring-billed gulls on the beach. Those are the big three. And it's kind of just an interesting factoid that ring-billed gulls do not breed on Appledore. There are none of them. Ring-billed gulls do tend to be more of a southern species, so you get more of them breeding on the islands off of Massachusetts, like the Harbor Islands where there are gulls there, or off of Cape Cod. And really, those are the three common gulls around here. And so out of those three, we have two of the three, which I think is not that bad. And then if you go farther south, like if you spend time on Cape Cod, you'll see a lot more laughing gulls. So that would be another one people tend to ask about. We don't get those breeding on Appledore either. The one other kind of gull that we have had breeding on Appledore is the lesser black-backed gull. So that's a very common gull in Europe and occasionally makes forays over here to North America, has been reported breeding occasionally in Greenland. Appledore Island is the only place, as far as I know, still the only place where lesser black-backed gull has bred. And because they're not that common, this lesser black-backed gull that turned up on Appledore couldn't find any other lesser black-backed gulls at the Gull Singles Bar, so actually took up with a herring gull. And birds are not, we tend to think, we're taught in biology classes like, okay, if you get two different species, they can't breed together and make fertile offspring. That's how you know they're two separate species. Birds do not act like that. Birds make hybrids all the time. So we had a lesser black-backed gull on Appledore mated to a herring gull. They laid eggs successfully, hatched babies successfully. The babies grew up successfully. We banded some of the babies. He bred for a few years. He hasn't been back in a long time, and we haven't had any other individuals of his species. So he was a major celebrity for a while. He was given all kinds of nicknames. There were t-shirts made in his honor. He was very famous, but we haven't heard from him in a very long time. But you can still see that kind of hybrid out in the world. And there's these people that get really into gull hybrids that will look at pictures and be like, okay, is that a herring gull in this cross, or is it like a quarter this and 3/4 this? So they definitely crossbreed all the time. And we're always sort of hoping that there will be another kind of European vagrant to spice up the joint.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. I think that that's all for questions. That's everything that we have in the chat.
All right.
So I am going to, I put one in earlier, but I'm going to drop one in right now. If anyone here would like to fill out a feedback form, that would be wonderful. And thank you so much to Sarah. And I will unmute everyone so you can say your goodbyes.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, you can all unmute yourselves, and we're closing in on 8:30. So thank you so much for your time here tonight.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. That talk was awesome.
Thanks.
And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight.
That's a good crowd. It's so funny to see these names of people I know. I'm like, oh man, I hope it's all right. All right, I'm gonna go eat my supper.
All right.
Good night.
Wonderful. Goodbye, everyone.